Hey everyone, it's Mark and welcome to Article Club. We are an experiment in community reading where we read, annotate, and discuss one great article every month on race, education, or culture. This month we're discussing How the Black Vote Became a Monolith by Theodore R. Johnson. It's a great article, and I'm happy to announce that it's looking like we're going to have a record turnout at our discussion on Sunday, February 28th at 2 p.m. Pacific Time. If you haven't signed up but want to, please do. You can email me at mark@highlighter.cc to reserve your spot. But before talking for too long, I want to get right to the point of today's podcast episode, which is to bring you an interview of Dr. Johnson that Sarai and I were fortunate to do last week. It was so great to have this conversation with him. Dr. Johnson talked about his work at the Brennan Center for Justice, expanded on some of the main points of his article, and offered his thoughts about the future of voting and political engagement for Black Americans. Here's our conversation. Thank you so much for doing Article Club.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be here.
So Sarai and I have some questions for you. The first one I'll take, which is, okay, so you are a senior fellow at the Brennan Center. So like senior fellow, like that seems I like that. And so what does that mean? And also like, what are you excited about right now? What are you working on right now as a senior fellow?
Yeah, so senior fellow basically is like at a think tank, is like a professor without students. So you get to do all of the writing, all of the research, and none of the teaching that usually would come with like a tenure track university position. So I love students and I do adjunct teach on the side, but I love the idea of being able to go into work with questions and spend my day investigating those questions. And all of the questions I investigate are about how we can make a more racially equitable society and strengthen our democracy. And that sounds like those two things are really compatible, but oftentimes the more strides you take towards racial equity, the more certain actors in a democratic system try to leverage that initiative or that effort to divide the public and for political expediency's sake in order to hold on to office or curry favor with certain coalitions. So it's really challenging work, I think really important work. And so I spend my days writing long form essays like the ones we'll talk about today, op-eds responding to current affairs or political moments, and thinking about longer projects like books or public events where we can bring some of this scholarship and empirical research to the public in a way that's accessible and helps them understand how theory and research applies to the sort of the practical application of it.
Cool, thank you. And Sarai, at any point, jump on in.
Sure. I'm like, I would love to know more about that, like on a job trajectory path. But I feel like that's like another conversation because you don't often hear about folks who are excited about learning and teaching, getting to spend that time doing that thought formation, right? So yeah,
right.
Your job for sure.
Yeah. So I've just become the director of the Fellows Program over the last few months. And I'm looking to reorient it and expand it to focus on questions of racial equality, gender equality, the future of the Constitution, and things like civic education and social cohesion, how we can create effective bonds between the public in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. The Brennan Center's mission writ large, it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank / legal advocacy firm where we look to defend voting rights, reform the electoral system to get dark money out of our elections. We also work to end the mass incarceration and then to protect people's civil liberties from government surveillance and things like immigration or like the recent Muslim ban. We fight the federal government and states that infringe on folks' civil liberties in those ways.
Yeah, that's just so interesting. Like you say that all the stuff that you're working on right now, that's super inspiring. But then in your piece that we're all reading, like you acknowledge right at the beginning that like the first time you voted, you were 33 years old. So like, what was that all about?
Yeah, at first writing that, I was kind of ashamed, and frankly, I never admitted that publicly until I wrote the piece because. For one, my parents are children of the Jim Crow generation. My father grew up in South Carolina. My mother grew up in Georgia in segregated schools and communities, indigent, sharecroppers, et cetera. And so for them, voting was a big deal. And when they came of age, you had to be 21 to vote. So they were in college and they took it seriously and they voted in every election and primary, et cetera, since. So to recognize that history and then to voluntarily opt out of it wasn't a particular point of pride for me. But I think I had gotten comfortable, like most Americans. And frankly, I grew up, my parents had it tough, but they went to college and were IBMers for their entire career. So I grew up like Theo Huxtable on The Cosby Show and didn't face the sort of oppression and dangers that they did. Certainly I was discriminated against in different ways, but nothing like they faced. So I took a lot of it for granted. I also served in the military, so I kind of felt like, who's going to tell me that I'm not doing my part as an American if I'm serving in the military? But the biggest thing was, I think last year or the year before, the Knight Foundation found that 100 million voting eligible Americans sit out every presidential election. And so it made me realize that in admitting that I'd opted out, I was actually I was providing a lens into those 100 million Americans who choose not to vote. And so sharing my story, I think, a lot of people could see themselves in my story and their decisions not to vote. And then a lot of folks who look at folks like me and, how could you be a grandchild of sharecroppers and not vote and get a better understanding of why it was that I chose not to. So sharing that personal story up front was a way of bringing the readers in and sort of going on this journey with me instead of preaching from a pedestal of saying, we have responsibilities and the nation has not lived up to its principles and citizens are not living up to their responsibilities. We've got to get it together. I wanted to show, no, I'm in this fight with you. I'm learning alongside you the history, the responsibilities. So let's take this journey together.
Like, honestly, like when I read that, I was like, all right, cool. Like I tend to be of the opinion that like we oftentimes try to like place blame on people who don't engage like in a system that has honestly like removed entire sections of culture, removed entire sections of people's family. And then it's often said like, oh my God, you're not doing your job. It's like, well, come on. And then when you talk about like all these things about how the Black vote, how there's conservatism and liberalism within Black politics, but not in the Black vote, like it creates even more dissonance. And honestly, you can tell in my tone, it like makes me even more angry. Like the ways that Black politics don't get talked about because of this like monolith. And then people are allowed to go ahead and judge people who don't necessarily want to engage in that process.
Right.
Like, and so, right, there's that piece of it, right? And there's this piece of like, okay, well, things are different now. Like, we have a job to do, like, but like, if you look at it, and I think this was one of the points in your piece is that like, even within your own family, even your parents had differences politically, but they would have voted maybe the same. And
right.
So like that creates this like gap, this like chasm to where, number one, like white people are allowed, or politicians are allowed to think that we're all the same. And number two, we're not allowed to really talk to each other about what our differences are.
Yeah, there's just so much like sociology and political science and history to sort of throw at it. But I think generally speaking, Black folks are just like every other kind of American. When you ask Americans, why don't you vote? They say, I think politicians are corrupt. I don't think the government cares about me. Government's not responsive to what I wanted to do. So and participating in the voting process, registering, finding my place to vote, looking through all these candidates, some of whom I don't know who they are, what they stand for, what their policy agenda is. And I'm supposed to go through all of this effort just to create a system that doesn't respond to what I want from it. And so they question whether or not it's worth their time. And the burden I think that Black folks are saddled with is, I hear that, but do you know how many people died for you just to have the option to vote? Do you know how many people bled and fought to get this right? And you're just going to toss it away and not take advantage of it? But women did the same thing to get to the 19th Amendment, and white immigrants had the same sort of fight. So every group has had to struggle to, voting has never been, universal suffrage has never been an American principle. It's never been something that the nation agreed was an unquestionable good. Every generation has had to fight to make our democracy more inclusive. So every nation or every group in the country has this story about people before you fought for this right and you're not taking advantage of it. So in this way, Black folks are very much like other groups, but the Black experience is not. It's very distinct. And again, oppression has touched a little bit of everyone, but chattel slavery was a very unique kind of evil. And so to come from slavery to a point where you can participate in democracy is a journey that should not be taken for granted. And so you've got that, and then you've sort of got this added responsibility despite the unresponsiveness of the system. And then you've got a kind of politics that exploits racism in order to divide people and subjugate some and sort of privilege others. So now you're telling Black folks, not only do you have this responsibility, but you also have to dilute or depress your own political preferences.
And that's what you said.
Your group, right? Exactly. For the sake of your group, because the only way you can ever touch a little bit more freedom is if you all work together in the way that you vote, even if your politics are disparate. And those two burdens of democracy are the things that Black Americans saddle in a unique way. It's a phenomenon that's being discussed more in public, that historians and political scientists have been uncovering for quite a few years.
It's a whole thing to unpack, right? Because like when you think about it, like when you're talking about in your article, you had talked about the way capitalism was used, the way that compromises were used, to the way that rights were given, and kind of like this bartering, this like promise giving situation. And it seems that like you can expect a couple things, right? It seems that you can expect like white people to be able, or, privileged groups to be able to vote for nuance, whereas, Black folks and marginalized folks are literally voting to try to stay alive, like to try to evade white terror. The word choice, some of the word choices that you use when you're talking about like the Black vote, you call it existential and utilitarian, like very practical, very for like a reason larger than ourselves, right? And that, to me, again, is particularly infuriating, especially when you're like counting down to individual votes, and you're trying to, when you're counting Georgia and when you're counting Pennsylvania, when you're counting like Arizona down to individual votes, and people are going to say that even that process is corrupt, and put practices in places even after the election that are going to disenfranchise voters. What you're talking about is the creation of that monolith. I think it's so dangerous because it doesn't allow for people. Obviously, the monolith suggests that there's not a variation, but those variations are being exploited. That lack of variation is being absolutely exploited by capitalism, by politics, in order to keep us in this place where we're like, I can't even get to know my neighbor because we have to vote the same way, but I could potentially like not agree with their politics,
Right.
I don't know.
I think since the Civil War, since Black freedmen got the right to vote, almost every presidential election, the vast majority of congressional and state elections have been single issue direct democracy referenda for Black voters. It's not been comparing one party's policy agenda versus the others. It's been which party is more pro civil rights, period. That's the only question we can afford to ask. I can't ask about national security or taxes or regulation or the environment or abortion or same-sex. All these other questions are secondary to the prime question of which party is not going to be revanchist in its racial politics.
But those things are the things that Black people are caring about too, like homophobia in the Black community, lack of food resources in the Black community.
All of that gets muted. All those preferences get muted in our two-party system of democracy. And so this is why you see Black folks voting so monolithically on election days, because our parties have aligned over the question of race. There's always been one party that's more pro-civil rights and one party that's more racial conservative, if not outright segregationist. And so it removes agency from Black voters when the parties are presented in this way, and it doesn't allow us to express ourselves the kind of way we express ourselves at the barbershop and beauty salons and churches and book clubs and all these places outside of the public eye. We see the diversity. The public doesn't get that opportunity.
Yeah, Sarai and I really appreciated your focus on history. One thing that I think a lot of, at least white liberals, would be talking about is, we know about the Southern strategy, but then you also pointed out what I basically am calling the Northern strategy of the 1940s, where it's like, hey, like Black people, we know, vote as a block monolithically. So now after Great Migration, let's actually win the election. Can you say more about that? Can you speak?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the shortcomings in the way we teach American history, one of the many, is that Jim Crow and racism was a Southern problem, and that Northerners were enlightened and didn't practice discrimination and all that. It's just not true at all. So what we see happening in the Great Migration from 1900 to 1960, about 6 million Black people leave the South. Before 1900, 92, 93% of Black folks in America lived in Southern states. And by 1960, 1970, something like 45% of Black folks live outside of the South. And so their destination states, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, they see these influx of Black migrants who begin to change local politics. Because remember, the 14th and 15th Amendment made them citizens and gave them the right to vote. But in the South, those rights have been removed from Black folks in ways that they had not been removed in the North, because there wasn't enough of a Black population to make a difference for government to exert that much energy in removing those rights. So as Black folks start moving in, they begin to access the franchise and alter local and state politics. And so what happens is Northern Democrats, the Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln, but they're getting distant from that whole super pro-civil rights Black suffrage piece and thinking more along economic terms. And so in the North, frankly, nationwide, Republicans are starting to say all these civil rights requirements and regulations that are coming along are making it hard for businesses to operate. And so the same kind of Republican Party we recognize today that doesn't like regulation was pushing back on the civil rights regulations that would require hiring and housing protections for these new Black migrants. At the same time, you've got Southern Democrats who are saying separate but equal, keep Black folks in their place. And then you've got Northern Democrats that aren't married to the regulatory stance and aren't really married to the racial politics of the South. They are basically opportunists. And they say, we've got all these Black voters who are kind of homeless in their politics. Let's go for them. And they do. And so we see FDR make pushes for him. We see Truman, he made an explicit push for Black voters, and thanks to Black migrants in Illinois and Ohio, wins the 1948 election months after desegregating the military and desegregating the federal workforce. Political actions that were not a result of moral epiphanies that he had suddenly in 1948, but because he recognized, I will not win the 1948 presidential election if I don't have Black voters supporting me. So the North is where we've seen today still the most segregation in schools. They fought most vociferously against busing because the urban areas were northern places, not in the southern states that still were quite rural in the early part of the 20th century. So it had its own version of Jim Crow. It just was exercised with more regulatory ways, and also through the use of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, where white immigrants who were treated like second-class citizens took patronage jobs as a way to get ahead themselves, but served as a buffer between political and economic elites in the North and these new Black migrants that everyone kind of agreed were unwelcome, the sort of white populations in the North. So white immigrants, you see lots of them joining police forces, Italians, the Polish, Irish, in these northern and Midwestern cities as buffers between Black migrants and the elite. And that is how they're policed in the North, through police forces and law enforcement. And in the South, terrorism and vigilantism is sort of the order of the day. It's incredible.
It seems to me like you had talked about the way that history is taught. Like I definitely got the North, yes. But coming through and hearing all the things that you're talking about, and realizing folks like James Baldwin talking about how California was just as racist as the worst places in the South, like all these different things, like it makes me think of, and Mark and I had been talking about this a little bit, it makes me think of like the pawnship this creates out of Black people and Black voters, and the tokenism that this creates. Because, right, you have like such cognitive dissonance. So take the Great Migration, for example. You have folks like moving. My family was like parts of my family were a part of that. Came on over here to California, came on over to the sawmills, but nobody ever told me that there were sawmills in Arkansas. Nobody ever told me that people were owning sawmills in Arkansas, but that's besides the point. So we come, people are talking about how only people who were able to leave left, only the privileged of folks who are left. And so you have this this breaking up of the Black community that would provide more variation that would provide more different like perspective and points of view, different levels of education, different job interests. And you kind of pluck those people and put them in different places and switch up the way you regulate them so you think that it's becoming different, but still let capitalism rule kind of the way that rights are given politically, right? And like you create this like pond to where, okay, if you move to the north, you have to deal with this. If you move to the south, you have to deal with this. If you move to any other place, or let alone, God forbid, if you don't vote in 2021, someone's gonna call you like, you know what I mean?
Right,
like
right.
this, I feel that like the pawnship that is created out of not only our vote, but our issues, you know, our struggles,
Yeah.
like all of those things. When you talk about the way that these policies were codified, these things were codified within our nation, right? Like that seems like, how do we get away from that?
There's no escaping it. And so structural racism is that is its job, is to turn people into instruments and tools in service of a broader structuring of society. And so when Black folks moved around, it was basically choose your oppression. You know,
Right.
There's the violent social sort in the South. There's the kinder, gentler, but just as prolific and unjust kinds in the North, and a different variety in the Midwest and the West. So it's kind of a big question, but here's where I'll say we're seeing some of its remnants and its evolution over time. So in Democratic primaries, this is where you get to see some of the variety of politics in Black America, because now everyone's in the same party. So the party heuristic, that is taken away. And now you can assess people on their character or their policy stances or their past. And so what we're seeing, and this is what we saw in 2020, is that regions of Black folks vote differently. The southern parts, Black folks living in the South tend to be older and more conservative. So it's no wonder that South Carolina Black voters went for Biden, because he was sort of pragmatic, centrist, well-established reputation. Even if it wasn't perfect, they know who the guy was, and that mattered. But when you went to the Midwest and the West, you saw more Black folks who were younger voting for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, because their politics are shaped differently. The issue is that in 1970, I was born in 75, so I grew up in North Carolina, but even after I went to college and met Black folks from all over the country, I went to Hampton and HBCU, everyone was like the grandchild of someone from the South.
Right.
You were like only 1 or 2 generations removed from the South, if you were removed at all. But today, you will see people whose grandparents or great-grandparents were born in New York or Chicago or Boston or California. And so that tie to the South, that shared experience, historical experience, isn't the same for this generation as it was for my generation. And as a result, the politics begin to take on regional flavors, where it's more progressive out West, younger up North, and older and more conservative in the South. It's demonstrated, particularly in Democratic primaries, for Democratic presidential primaries. So it is a choose your oppression sort of in a historical sense, but the presence of oppression is a feature of the Black experience in America. But the answer to that oppression is different based on your generation, based on the regions now where you live, and based on sort of even the local and state politics and how responsive they are to.
Yeah. Wow.
Wait, did you just say something? It seemed like you were a little bit hopeful there, meaning like, especially in primary, is that where you're going? Because in your piece, you're talking about how deliberation is the lifeblood of a healthy democracy. Toward the end of your piece, you're talking about how you got back together with your family. You all really talked about the issues, but it was almost like this moment that wasn't totally real. It was like a private moment that you had with your family. But now I feel like you said something a little bit more hopeful than what was going on in the piece, or are you saying that that's just like saved for primaries?
I'm saying we have like reasons to hope, but just because we get glimpses of what a functional democracy could look like where Black folks aren't shoved into a corner, doesn't mean that our democratic system is going to respond to those inclinations. So Black Twitter was alive, and Kamala Harris was in the primary still, Elizabeth Warren in the primary still, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and there were Black people debating about which candidate would be better for racial equity, for racial justice, for economic security, et cetera. And those were real debates. But as soon as the nomination was decided and it's now Trump versus Biden, we saw the very dangerous things in democracy that I warn about in the piece. We saw everyone sort of come together. Look, we had our debates, we had our disputes, but now we recognize something bigger is at play here. Right. We can either vote for the Democrats who are more pro-civil rights, or we can vote for Trump and the Republican Party, which appears to be, racially revanchist. Now there's no room for debate anymore. Yeah. Now the debate around healthcare, Medicare for all versus a public option, or forgiving student loans versus baby bonds, like all those conversations went out the window, or at least were muted some. And it was which candidate is not going to roll back voting rights, which candidate is going to shrink the criminal justice system. And then the difference gets muted. So there are reasons to be hopeful when we can engage politics more fully and comprehensively and show our diversity. But our two-party winner-takes-all system of politics, congressional and presidential, and frankly, gubernatorial and senatorial, often rolls back whatever hope I feel in a primary season, because at the end of the day, on November election days, you're choosing between the Civil Rights Party and the party that doesn't appear to be that interested in it. And that does not give me, and I don't think that distinction is going to end anytime soon, unless there's some really principled leadership coming out of the Republican Party in short order. And given the Senate trial around impeachment, I think we're gonna have to wait a little bit longer.
Don't even get me started. Don't even get me started on this clown show. Okay, regardless, something that's really sticking with me, I'm like 33, around the same age that you were when you had first voted, right. And I understand what you're saying about people not having like a connection to the South. But the connection I've always had to the South is that it was terrible for Black people to live there. Like it was nothing, right. When I had traveled to Mississippi and lived there 6 months, everybody was like, why, why would you even put yourself in that situation? And in my brain, I'm like, at least out there, it's up front. Like, at least out there, I can, like, somebody will call me upon to my face, and speaking to that, like internal oomph, like internal will to stay engaged, like what advice, like what kind of like words do you have? Because like I watched all 4 hours of the impeachment arguments yesterday, and by the end of it, like I was like, on one hand, I was like, okay, it's fine. Like my life is like not on the best terms right now, but I'm fine. Like if they can let this guy get up here and argue for Trump. But on the other hand, I'm like, these are the people that are responsible for making the decisions, right. And have been. So how do you stay like hopeful, whatever, like I'm not concerned about that word. Like how do you stay realistically engaged?
It's tough, but I think you just have to find the good news stories that show how people's efforts, even if it's long-term, decade-long efforts, are changing our society. Look, we're not perfect, but I'm much happier being a Black man in 2020 than I would be being a Black man in 1920. And that progress is real, and that didn't just happen. That is the result of Black folks' work, and along with many other Americans who recognize we're not living up to our principles. And so be part of that work so that in 100 years, folks aren't saying, why did the previous generations get comfortable and let this thing fall apart? And instead we'll say, I am so thankful that as horrible as they had it compared to us today, that they kept fighting. Wow. So there's that. The other part of it is, even in the South, you still have very red Republican states, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida's quite red, South Carolina. But in those states, you have the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, Black man. Mayor of Richmond, Virginia, Black man. Mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Black man. Mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, Black woman. And mayor of Atlanta, Black woman. So in these really red states, there is Black political power that is ascendant, that is, I think, is creating a new South. And I think the future of American democracy is going to be tied to the future of democracy in the South when state-level Republican leadership begins to butt heads with local-level right. Black leadership across party lines, and we will see how they can manage them. Some other folks, Charles Blow, I think, recently made this argument, like, if racism is everywhere, then why live in New York City where racism is going to cost you $500,000 for a one-bedroom apartment, and everyone here votes Democrat anyway, when you can move to Georgia and live, much better in a cheaper cost of living, and maybe begin to flip red states like Georgia was and turn them into blue states to be more friendly to questions of racial justice and racial equality. So the problem is we can't do it all. So you kind of have to pick your area to fight, recognize that you may not win that fight in your lifetime, but that your legacy is the fighting. Your legacy is that you continue the journey from previous generations that you can lead to the next generation, and you may have a better quality of life in the process of it, because that fight gives you purpose. And not completely satisfying, but it at least gives you like a superordinate goal to work towards that I think has to be the reason that the fight against racism is a multi-generational fight, and it's just our turn to do our part.
Yeah, that's awesome. Finding that part is tough. It's already taken so long.
Yeah, I think the fight is worth it though, and it does require, Abraham Lincoln like reinterpreted the Declaration of Independence, and Martin Luther King reinterpreted the Constitution and the Declaration for a new generation. So I think part of the challenge is latching on to the things that define America's principles or promise or goals that we're not living up to, and then showing, look, do we believe in equality? Well, let's look at all the ways that we're not fostering equality, and show how the fight to end structural racism is actually the same fight for equality and liberty that previous generations have fought for. And the marriage of the American mythology to the very real fight for structural racism is important, because it shows that the two things are not in tension, which, a lot of folks would like to believe either you love the country or you think the country is racist, but you can't do both. Like, no, you can do both. Like, the country has behaved in racist ways since its beginning, and the country can be better than that. So let's hold both of those ideas together and walk from the racism of the past through the experiences of racism today to a future where racism may never be erased, but it at least be mitigated for future generations.
Yeah. When people ask me what I'm doing, I'm like, oh, I'm in the think tank. Like, you've just given me a whole new way to just be in my room thinking about things.
Thinking about stuff. That's right. And trying to move the conversation just a little bit. Yeah, it's a good life. I can't lie. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for chatting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your piece. Thanks so much for speaking with us. I can't wait to talk with article clubbers about this piece. Just thank you so much for making the time.
No, thank you. And I would love to come back. My book comes out in June. So it's 300 pages of all of this stuff and then some. So there will be more to discuss.
Do you have a title for it?
I do. It's called When the Stars Begin to Fall, which is a line from an old Negro spiritual. And the subtitle is Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. And it basically shares the lessons of Black solidarity since our arrival here and takes those attributes and shows how we can create a multiracial solidarity by learning from Black people's experience in the United States.
That sounds great. And so, really like Article Club is also technically a book chapter club too. So like,
perfect.
Would love to have you back if you're open to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you again for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to talk to you.
Enjoy yourself today. Take care.
Thanks.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
I want to thank Dr. Johnson yet again for taking the time to answer our questions about his outstanding article. Thank you so much for being so gracious and generous and for deepening our thinking. Everyone out there who's listening, if this interview interested you and you're not signed up yet for this month's discussion, I encourage you to give Article Club a try. You can find out more information over at articleclub.org. All right, that's it for now. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great week.